Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnac and my co-host Rob Brantar, joined today by Kwatuuma Cole Sayers, co-founder and executive director of the Indigenous Power Coalition. Kwatuuma has built his career in clean energy advocacy and First Nations partnerships, starting in clean energy project development funding, moved into the executive director role at Clean Energy BC, and is now leading a direct effort to position First Nations as collective owners in major transmission infrastructure. Canada is entering one of the largest electricity infrastructure buildouts in its history. Transmission lines, grid interconnections, and clean power capacity will cross dozens of First Nations territories. The infrastructure cannot proceed without Indigenous partnership and equity ownership. Here's what investors need to understand. When First Nations frame these projects as assets generating benefits across 7 generations, they're describing a governance structure that aligns precisely with pension capital fund holding periods. The alignment is deliberate, it's structural, and will make a difference. In our conversation, you'll discover why development stage capital is now the real bottleneck for Indigenous-led infrastructure. The pre-development phase, where costs run $100 to $200 million, is where risk is highest and capital is thinnest. You'll learn how First Nations collective ownership actually de-risks transmission projects for sponsors and their financiers. And you'll understand why European pension funds and infrastructure investors are increasingly active in Canadian electricity transmission, anchored by Indigenous equity partners managing 100-year assets.
Kwatuuma Cole Sayers, the co-founder and executive director of the Indigenous Power Coalition. Thanks for joining us. Really a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, great to have you join us, Cole. Let's get right into the conversation. So you founded the Indigenous Power Coalition just a few months ago, I understand, and then in July you launched the Western Transmission Catalyst Initiative. So there's a lot going on. Can you introduce yourself to our UK and international audience, primarily made up of asset managers, investment managers, and corporates, and tell a little bit about yourself, of course, and then how you've ended up to where you are today and what you're actually trying to build?
For sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Rob and Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Kwatuuma Cole Sayers. I'm calling in from my home territory on central Vancouver Island, and of course now called Port Alberni, British Columbia. I am Hoopa-Chusett, and I've been a clean energy advocate for most of my career. I started in a funding role to help First Nations clean energy projects, small-scale clean energy projects in British Columbia get started. And that was, anywhere from demand-side management programs to small-scale renewables in remote and rural communities, displacing diesel. But then there was a challenge. There was an opportunity to sell power, so I moved into an advocacy role, and that's where I became the executive director of Clean Energy BC, which is an industry association for the renewables industry in British Columbia. So that's where I started to advocate for the need for the growing demand that was looming, and then also advocate for First Nations partnerships in procurement. And things have changed very, very quickly. Demand did materialize, and we were really scrambling to procure new power. So I work with BC Hydro, the crown utility here, to help them bring in First Nations in the procurement design, how partnerships can be structured in a way that is flexible to allow for First Nations to choose how they want to participate. And on the back end, just really support nations on the capacity building side with creating materials for strong partnerships, key considerations, and things like that. In my previous hat, we had over 80 BC First Nations members, and so we always congregated to see what are your needs, how can we meet them, how can we support you. So there was this opportunity to join and co-found an organization that could elevate the role of First Nations in major projects by filling a need. And there was a need as an organization to play a convener role to support truly Indigenous-led major projects that would be on their terms, That way we can move from just passive participants to project proponents, project leaders, owners, and long-term partners. And a lot of nations, they're growing their technical expertise, their capacity. And so now it's just a matter of like when you're dealing with linear infrastructure, you're dealing with, 10, 20, 30 nations. So but how do you bring them together so that they're a collective owner that's on their terms? That's where the Indigenous Power Coalition comes in. And we have some support, financial support from federal government and other sources that support our work in terms of convening and capacity building for First Nations. And hopefully we'll have projects in the next few years. It's still early and I'm unfortunately not able to speak too much to it, but our focus is electricity, specifically interprovincial transmission. And McCann's entering one of the largest electricity infrastructure buildouts in its history, and much of that infrastructure will cross First Nations territories. And that's why it's critical that we center First Nations leadership in those projects. And the Western Transmission Catalyst complements that work by addressing the technical, policy, and planning barriers that slow major transmission projects. And also, it also addresses some historical barriers for interprovincial transmission, because historically there have been challenges where provinces don't work together. There's complexity with different market structures, and so we've addressed that in our initiative to bridge that gap. And one of the key ways is that modeling, so we all have a collective truth on terms of how does this line impact both systems, and that will help everybody be on the same page. So it can answer questions like cost allocation or distribution of benefits. In addition to convening those utilities, those provinces, all the players that are needed in the same room so that we can all have this conversation about how do we get this built, and also how do we advance reconciliation with First Nations at the same time. So we're hoping to elevate Indigenous leadership in major projects, not just for the electricity sector, but also for other industries as well.
Well done, Cole.
Yes, excellent summary of what's going on. Just before we go on, just one follow-up. Can you explain a little bit about the North American grid? Because you're talking about the interprovincial issues, but the grid, we have a shared grid with the US. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. So I know European, and I'm not the expert on interregional electricity planning. We have members who study that, Madeline McPherson and Blake Schaefer. I know the European context, there's a lot of great examples of different jurisdictions being connected and sharing trading power. In North America and Canada, the US specifically, the Canadian grids, it's broken down by province, and they're all kind of little islands. They're not connected east-west. Most of our power goes north-south. So BC, we have a lot of hydropower. Same with Quebec and Manitoba. Most of that power goes south. And then power from the US comes up when it's available, whether it's solar or wind, nuclear, whatever it is. And so there's been a priority to enhance more east-west electricity trading for sovereignty, but also just for technical reasons, reliability, affordability. These types of interconnections between grids shows all these benefits to the ratepayers and the taxpayers, in addition to like all the additional economic benefits that come when you have more available power. You have infrastructure to increase affordable supply to jurisdictions. So all these benefits that we see, and we are trying to remind folks that these are the benefits. It benefits everybody. We need to move from each of our sides to see the benefits of more connections. And so European, I'm sure it's nothing new, but in the US and Canada, specifically Canada, we need to do more. We need to build more.
Yeah, well done, Cole, for this initiative. As you said, the need is huge across the country. Maybe talk a little bit about your family. You're from a well-known West Coast family. Your mother was chief of the Hupakaseth, and maybe talk about what you learned from her, your family generally, about development, Indigenous-led development, and how that's evolved over the last few years and decades.
Yeah, Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I've always learned from my mom. She's been a trailblazer, and for Indigenous economic development and reconciliation. She was certainly an advocate in the early days, back when reconciliation wasn't a thing. And I remember she was working with this mining company, and this guy, Marco Romero, was seen as a pariah because of how much he went to the First Nations and wanted to involve them in partnerships. And this was like, early 2000s. But now that's the standard. So it's remarkable how things change. And so what my mom taught me was that, it's leadership isn't just about opposing projects. It's about creating better alternatives. You can't to provide solutions. And so instead of a smelter plant in Port Alberni, she wanted to go out and find renewable energy development. And so she built the first First Nations majority owned and led Runner River project. And so that's just for folks who don't know what that is. It's when you have rainwater and you use a creek at usually higher elevations, and it goes down a penstock, which is like a pipe, and then the pipe goes through the turbine. So it's mostly rainwater. It's usually higher elevations, so you don't impact fish. And then that creates electricity, clean, emissions-free electricity. And it's about 6.5 megawatts, so it's not big, but it's a good size for our nation. And it was the first one about 20 years ago that she built. And I remember as a kid, she was learning how to build this project. And I always remember there was one guy in the industry back then who said First Nations would never own renewable energy projects because they're just too complicated. And so she was, so she took that as a challenge and said, well, I'm going to build one. And she did. And I remember we had some folks from China who were suppliers and manufacturers for turbines, and they came to Port Alberni, and we were having dinner at this local Chinese restaurant, one of our favorites called Beijing. And yeah, it was great to see the process of her learning as a kid. And so I'm just trying to.
What years are we talking when that was going on?
Probably like 2003.
Yeah.
Or actually maybe before that, actually 2001, 2002.
Right.
Early 2000s.
So imagine how far we've come in 20 odd years.
20, yeah. And she started the First Nations working group in the Clean Energy BC to help build capacity. She did a lot of the early work. And so when I got there was already a strong base of a network of First Nations who sharing best practices, knowledge, mentorship. So we were just about creating space and supporting that space for those nations to continue that important work. And so now I am now kind of just in her footsteps, trying to see where there's a need and try to advocate for providing solutions to that need. And right now, that's, I think, system level thinking for how do we expand our electricity system to meet growing need, and how do we do it in the most affordable way possible to benefit the ratepayer, the taxpayer, and First Nations.
Yes, and a very timely moment with fires burning across the European continent, huge fires across North America and Canada's boreal forest. And here we are talking about clean energy. We're behind the 8 ball. Okay, we've had our southern neighbor decide, we don't need that, which is just an unfortunate, it'll be a blip in history of the time lost for that. But in the two roles that you have, you've talked a little bit about the two organizations and explained a bit, but can you just go through that once again so it's very clear? Because the organization that you started earlier is about helping coalitions of nations get themselves ready, whereas the Catalyst project is about breaking down barriers between provinces and the infrastructure and the grid itself. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. Yeah, and for sure. And the Indigenous coalition building is through the Indigenous Power Coalition, and the Western Transmission Catalyst does include Indigenous leadership as a core principle, but its core work is also the modeling aspect. So we have Dunsky advisors who do a lot of modeling for utilities. We have some strong academics who advise the federal government in Madeleine McPherson and Blake Schaefer. So we have a robust modeling team, all really smart people. And so the challenge there is having a common set of truth where there's, common data sets from both systems and modeling that out about how a line could impact both systems. As of now, my understanding is that historically each utility, goes out with a preferred modeling consultant, and then they model the impact of a line, models the other system, but then the other system says like, well, that's it's wrong. Our modeler says this, and then negotiations break down once you get into the weeds around seams issues or other technical issues. So that's why we really need an objective, credible third party to collect that data and say this is the impacts based on this model that we've all collectively designed. This is both of your data sets. It's confidential, and so now we can have this common set of truth to inform our discussions. Especially when we start thinking around, how does the federal government play in a role? Every province wants the federal government to show up with a checkbook. Well, the federal government also needs to have these answers too. So it benefits everybody, helps move the conversation along. And on the Western Transmission Catalyst, we do have all 4 Western provinces signed on to our initiative, and each utility and grid operators. So it is progressing. We are optimistic, but utilities are very conservative creatures. Understandably, they have to maintain affordability for their ratepayers. So it's just a matter of just continuing to look at the bigger picture, that it's going to benefit you as well, and we can't get broken down into we can't get lost in the weeds, for example. And so they play the role of convener for the utilities, the provinces, to see that big picture while also addressing Indigenous participation.
Cole, when you look around, and it sounds like you can't talk about some of the projects that are in the works that you might be working on right now, but some of the projects that are public that you look to as models, maybe talk about some of those where you see the future. I'm thinking of things like the North Coast Transmission Line and Cool Power and the way they're leading. A proponent 50-50 on a transmission line with BC Hydro. But what do you see when you look out across the landscape?
Yeah, I think it's an evolution. I would say that, equity ownership isn't, whether it's minor or whatever the nominal amount is, it's not an endpoint. It's a transition point. We need to continue to elevate Indigenous participation in these projects, and oftentimes that's more in the weeds. How are they part of the decision-making authority of the project? And I'm always an advocate of greater First Nations participation and decision-making at all steps. Even in the BC hydro system and governance, and how decisions are made in their investments in their systems, so that First Nations are part of those decisions and not just passive equity owners where there's a line designed, built, then we're coming with you with an equity offer. We want to flip that script and say, well, let's start from the very beginning together and say that this is a potential project. This is how the nations want to be involved. They want to have they want to be involved with deciding and routing. They want to have this type of decision-making power. They want to be, so it's on their terms. And there's going to be a variation for the nations on capacity or interest or resources for, the extent to which they want to be involved. Their risk tolerance can vary, but we want to have that door open. And I think Cool Power and the North Coast Transmission Line are really great examples. I think it's, a step forward as we're seeing in Canada. So we just want to keep moving forward, building off Cool Power, building off of the example of NCTL, North Coast Transmission Line, and see how we can just elevate Indigenous equity ownership in major projects.
Yeah, when you talk about that progression, it's been years in the making, but the fight decades ago just to be noticed at all, and then legal rights defined more and more over time, and so consultation rights eventually. But sometimes those weren't meaningful consultations or meaningful accommodations after the consultation. And then equity stakes became prevalent. Sometimes those were very small stakes and maybe not as meaningful. And then now you're seeing, full-blown equal majority Indigenous-led major projects. So your organization is going to be right in the middle of a fair bit, I can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I think the window is open. I think we have to strike while the iron's hot and really help shape the discourses, but also policy and procurement design to really bake in higher standards. When I was working with BC Hydro, our goal was how do we create a floor without creating a ceiling? And the next one, just continue to elevate it. Indigenous benefits, both equity and non-equity, and have that progression and be able to measure it openly with the nations.
When we're overseas here and perhaps pension fund or institutional investor over in London, when they look and see these projects now, one, can you describe a bit about what this looks like? Because for a lot of them, they haven't heard about this, all the changes recently. It's kind of new from the Indigenous perspective. Obviously, it's great. You have a seat at the table that you always should have had, but now you have that. And some people might be, this is all unsettling for them. How would you pitch what's going on to investors over here?
It's a great question. And I might just start to plug my previous job. I had some European developers, in Spain, France, who were hugely supportive of First Nations equity partnerships, and would always fly out to Prince George or some remote community in the north to meet with their partners, or even just meet with the province to advocate all of our key messages around Indigenous participation and partnerships, supporting loan guarantees, all that stuff. So I think when folks see it on the ground, they become really not just believers but huge supporters. But for the investors, I think when they see an Indigenous-led project in the news, I think, or what does it look like? And I think it should look familiar to institutional investors using commercially recognized investment structures. Indigenous-led does not mean unconventional. It means nations have meaningful authority, economic participation, and long-term governance. And investors will continue to have that role of providing capital and receiving the governance rights that they would expect in infrastructure investments. Indigenous leadership, I think, helps reduce governance and relationship risk by aligning the nations most directly affected with the project's success. It's usually important when it's a linear infrastructure project like transmission, and it can traverse 20, 30 First Nations. And when you have those 20 or 30 First Nations leading one project together, well, we believe that creates greater certainty than one developer negotiating 20 to 30 separate relationships, which, I think there are other examples that we can look to see why that's not necessarily ideal and creates additional risk. And the Indigenous Power Coalition's role is to really help Indigenous-led projects become investment ready through strong governance and commercially bankable project structures.
Great overview.
Yeah, Cole, when you look across the country, especially in the West with the Western project underway, what barriers do you see still to Indigenous-led participation in these transmission projects and the intertie projects in particular? What needs to change, do you think?
Yeah, and in each province electricity is a provincial jurisdiction, and so there's variations. Manitoba, for example, it's not legally allowable for a non-crown utility to own transmission. I mean, British Columbia was the same up until I think last year, the year before. They had to change legislation to enable First Nations ownership in the North Coast transmission line, which it was 2025. Why did it take so long? But we're certainly glad that it's there, and they've been BC Hydro have been advocates for Indigenous equity ownership, and they've certainly shown that, and they're recent calls for power and the North Coast Transmission Line. And so if we can elevate Indigenous equity ownership and make it into legislation and policy changes required in provinces that could do that, well, BC has shown that it's possible. You just change the legislation, and you have loan guarantees, whether it's provincial. You have the Canada Infrastructure Bank with this very low cost loans to support Indigenous equity ownership, and then that's going to help enable that in terms of policy and legislation and access to capital. Financing these large equity stakes is still a significant challenge. Fortunately, we do have the Canada Infrastructure Bank and provincial loan guarantee programs in BC and Alberta and the federal government. However, financing First Nations-led project is still a challenge, because while there is financing available, at those later stages, there isn't really much at the very early stage, which is, sometimes the highest risk part of the project.
The development stage.
The development stage. And normally the developer would be fronting, 100 to 200 million on that pre-development costs. So for the nations that we're supporting, that's where we're struggling to find the money. And so that's where we're hoping that the federal government can come in to help at least give us some money, then we can go and get the rest for this development stage. Because it's high risk, but when you have all nations on side for a linear infrastructure project, I think that's pretty promising for a project. And so IBC helps those nations build these infrastructure, these projects so they're investment ready. And that's something that institutional investors can support.
Yeah, when just talking about capital, early stage capital, development capital, Canada's not a huge market, and so there's lots of room for international players to come in and facilitate that. There are lots of tools now available for Indigenous people to get involved that weren't available even 5-10 years ago. So that's encouraging. The First Nations Finance Authority, I guess, is another one for members who qualify, another source of capital. But like any lender, they want assets or revenue streams to secure those obligations. So it's still a challenge, but it's an opportunity too for international investors.
Yes, I think the one thing, though, that we've just heard today, and Rob has been reinforced over the years now with the summit, is that Canada's got its act together finally, because there is clarity about the path ahead. It's not, we don't know what will happen. We don't know about, are the Indigenous nations going to be behind this project, because they're rights holders now. So if they're not on board, it's not going to happen. And now that has happened, and given the Indigenous nations aren't, let's develop it to flip it, right? This is long-term sustainable. That actually reduces the risk. And I'm sure when you mentioned some of those earlier, in some of your earlier comments about the European firms, Spanish firms, et cetera, coming over and working, they were probably pleased in terms of the partnership to get things done and the commitment that they felt. So now at the development stage, Canada's always needed capital from the beginning of what was Canada even before then. It's always capital to develop the opportunity, because we're blessed in natural resources. So I think actually the business case becomes stronger now than it ever has been, especially in the world we're living in.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something that's consistently come through with the nations that we work with is, they're looking at like transmission line. These are 100-year assets. And so they're thinking, 7 generations down the line that, okay, it might be a lot of work and a challenge and big for us. But we work really hard for 10, 15 years, and then it's just going to continue to bring benefits to your communities. And there are potentially additional benefits, whether it's tying into that line and having additional generation opportunities. So it's definitely that long-term vision has been key to these types of assets.
So are you confident about the future, Cole? you look out 5 to 10 years in so many projects across the country, infrastructure, transmission pipelines, a lot to do with connecting the country in a way we've never, in the up north, connecting the country like we've never been connected before.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes and no. I think there's still a lot of work to do. I think the most optimistic thing that I see is that people recognize the need to build. They see the need for clean electricity and the infrastructure required to build out our system, whether it's for more emissions-free electricity, like renewables or battery storage, or more flexible base load, or big transmission lines that connect systems. I think that at least at the policy level, people see that, and people are trying to figure out how we can do that. But there's still a lot of work to do in terms of, how do we actually get these projects built? How do we support First Nations coalitions, or how do we continue to support First Nations equity ownership in major projects, so that, we're also respecting Indigenous rights. We're building these projects not only responsibly, but also in partnership with First Nations. I think we're on the right track, but I think there's still a lot more work to do, and we hope to continue working with our partners on addressing some of that.
Great. Is there something that we haven't asked you that you would like us to ask, or a point that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, I think we covered most of it. I mean, just in terms of European investors, I think, Canada needs an unprecedented amount of investment in our electricity infrastructure. I think long-term pension fund capitals will align with electricity infrastructure, and how investors can help shape a governance model to support Indigenous leadership. And we welcome that type of discussion, and are open, and want to encourage listeners that you can look at our website or find me on LinkedIn to advance these discussions, because we want to work with you and have discussions.
Great. Rob?
Well, yeah, now Goa, thank you very much, Kwatuuma, for joining us, and best of luck. I know we'll be hearing a lot more about the coalition in months and years to come.
Yeah, well, go. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Kwatuuma, thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into Drumbeats, where we bring you the capital markets intelligence that matters for Indigenous investment in Canada. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.